Hi, my name is Kate Fotos, and I work with two organizations doing maple education. The first is Future Generations University, doing adult maple education and research, and Experience Learning, an education nonprofit doing maple education in public schools across West Virginia. Let's talk about identifying maples. The first step to making maple syrup is finding your maple trees. And there's three easy identifying factors: leaf shape, branching pattern, and bark. We'll also talk about some common varieties to West Virginia. Let's start with leaf shape. Maple leaves have 5 lobes, which is that one section that orange arrow is pointing to that sticks out from the center of the leaf. And you can remember maples have 5 lobes because there's 5 letters in maple. You'll see some differences between maple leaves, both in lobe shape and also serrations. So some maple leaves are serrated, like this red maple leaf. You see that sawtooth pattern around the edges. And some maple leaves are unserrated, like sugar maples, which have those smooth edges. Another easy way to tell maples apart is branching pattern. Maples have opposite branching, and only maples, ash, and dogwoods have this kind of branching. Opposite branching is when branches come out of the same point along a tree. The other kind of branching pattern is called alternate, and this is where one branch comes off at each point, and they alternate which side they're pointing towards. Now, the cool thing is if a tree is opposite, that tree is totally opposite, even if you think you see some alternate branching. That's only because branches have broken off over time. And let's look at bark. Maple bark is kind of difficult because it can look very different depending on the age and variety of your tree. Most maple bark is grayish in color, and it tends to be very smooth when a maple is younger. As it grows older, you'll start to develop these longer, irregular plates, as you're starting to see in this middle, and by the time it is an older maple, it'll be totally covered in these longer plates with the edges starting to raise up a bit. But as you can tell, twigs and bark are kind of hard. So I highly suggest getting out when there's still leaves on your trees and finding your maples, and even marking them with a little bit of flagging tape for later in the season. So some common varieties in West Virginia are your sugar maples, which have those smooth-edged leaves, your red maples, which tend to have serrations. Silver maples are often planted in urban areas as a decorative tree. And also you'll see striped maples out in the mountains of West Virginia, though they never get very big. Most people make maple syrup in this state out of sugar maples and red maples. The nice thing is any kind of maple will make maple syrup. The only reason we attribute sugar maples to maple syrup is their sap tends to have a slightly higher sugar content than other varieties of maple. Now let's talk about the science of sap flow. There are 3 parts I really want to cover here, and that is that maples are diffuse porous, they build up pressure, and that there is a definitive end of the sugaring season. So let's start with diffuse porous. When we're talking about the type of pores you find in a tree, we're talking about the tubes that actually carry sap up and down the tree. And on the left, you see maple, which is diffuse porous. And here you see that those tubes happen throughout the tree. In diffuse porous trees, every year they grow new tubes throughout the year. And as you can see, there are lines that kind of signify the end of the growing season each year. These are what we call growth rings in a tree. The alternative to diffuse porous is ring porous, and this is what an oak is, and that's on the right here. And here you can see that there is a band of larger pores that happens once every growing season. So the big difference is in maple trees, they use year-old pores to transport sap, whereas oaks, every year, they just grow an entirely new set. Now, why is that important? This is important because this is actually what causes sap to flow out of maple trees. During the winter, trees go dormant. Maples are deciduous trees, so they lose their leaves and they go dormant. And as we start approaching spring, the trees will start to wake up and get ready to grow again in the warmer months. Now, over the winter, when the trees went dormant, the sap stopped flowing in those pores. The reason this is a problem is because sap travels through these pores in a continuous column of liquid. You can't have air bubbles within that column and still have sap reach the tippy top of each tree. Every year, maples have to create a solid column of liquid again before they can actually bud out and enter their growing season. And they do this during the freeze-thaw cycle in early spring. When it gets cold at night and freezes, maples actually pull water and nutrients into their roots from the soil. And then during the day, as it gets warmer, they start increasing their internal pressure. So basically what they're doing is pressurizing themselves, and what that does is it pushes these gas bubbles into the liquid and dissolves them, creating that solid column of liquid. It's kind of like a can of soda. The way they carbonate soda is that it is under pressure and they have dissolved carbon dioxide in the soda. Now, a tree is basically making itself kind of like a can of soda. It is pressurizing itself and pushing that gas into the sap and creates a solid column. Now, the reason this is helpful for us is because there is higher pressure inside the tree than there is outside the tree. So when you stick a tap in a maple tree during this freeze-thaw cycle, it will actually push sap out of itself and into a bucket. There's actually a pretty definitive end of season, and there's two things that can end your season. One is tap hole dry out. Now, a maple tree is a living creature, and like any living creature, if you put a hole in it, it wants to heal itself. So a tree will actually naturally develop scar tissue and block that sap flow. So your tap hole will dry out over time. The other end of season is bud out. So what we have on our right is a swelling bud, and what we have on our left is full bud break. When you start seeing those swelling buds, your maple season has come to an end. And that is because the sap composition actually changes as the tree enters a different phase of its growing season. And the new compounds you find in that sap actually give an off flavor in syrup. We've talked a bit about the tree science, and now let's start to get in how to actually make maple syrup. And I'm going to look at this from the standpoint of backyarding. What do you do if you only have a few trees and you want to make it around your house and with things you might already own? So the first thing to think about with maple syrup is your collection system. We've talked about when to tap, but once you tap, you do need something for that sap to flow into. And traditionally, people used buckets. Buckets for an at-home operation are great. They're easy to install, they're easy to collect, and if you only have a few trees around your house, there's no reason you would need anything more complicated. But if you're looking to be a bigger operation, tubing is another option. And maple tubing basically just connects all of your taps to a central collection location. They take a little bit more planning and a little bit more research, but if that's something you're interested in, there's a lot of information out there. And there's also some alternatives to these two more commercially available maple products. And these are the things that you might already have around your house or have more easily available to you. I do suggest buying specifically maple taps. It is better for the health of your tree. So some options are milk jugs. Milk jugs are food grade plastic. They'll hold about a gallon, which on a good day, your trees will give out about 2 gallons of sap. So they might not be big enough, but if you don't mind having a little bit of spillage, they're great. My one suggestion is tie them to your tree. They do like to blow away. You can also use 5-gallon food grade tubs. The one you're seeing in the picture at your lower right-hand corner is actually a frosting tub from a bakery. The thing to be cautious about is make sure you're using food grade plastic. The reason for this is sap is good at picking up off flavors, and having chemicals present in non-food grade plastic leach into it. And though it might be in little amounts in the raw sap, once you concentrate that into syrup, it actually gets to be a pretty large amount of contaminants. That's also something to be cautious about if you're thinking about using metal buckets out of your shed or that you found at your grandparents' farm. Older metal buckets were soldered with lead, and that lead will actually appear in your syrup if you use them. Now let's talk about tapping. When? As we were talking about, it's the start of that freeze-thaw cycle in spring. Now, there is a freeze-thaw cycle in fall, but in spring, you're going to get higher sugar content because the tree is pulling from its sugar stores to get ready to bud. Now, it's hard to put a specific date on when to tap because winters around here nowadays can be very different year to year. It can also be very different from location to location within the state. If you live at the top of a mountain, your season might be different than somebody living in the valley. The thing to do is find your local weather. There's some great apps and websites like Weather Underground that use local weather stations. So find the most accurate forecast for you and follow that forecast. What you're looking for in your 10-day is a good chunk of it being that freeze thaw, and you want to tap right before that happens. So for most people around here, it varies, but it's sometime from mid-January to early February is your ideal tapping time. Now, where to tap? You want to tap where it's comfortable for you in height-wise on the tree. So we always say about chest height. The other thing to look for is you want to avoid existing scar tissue, whether that's an old tap hole or where a branch used to be, a knot in the tree, a crack in the bark, or a bald spot. You want to avoid anything that looks irregular. Scar tissue, rot, all those things are not going to produce good sap for you. So a rule of thumb is look for where the bark looks uniform. Find a nice section where all the bark looks about the same and drill there. Now, how do you drill? The first thing to do is figure out what size drill bit you need. Most taps nowadays are 5/16. So you want to use a 5/16 inch drill bit. But bucket taps, if you do go out and purchase bucket taps, tend to be 7/16 inch. Now, how deep to drill? You want to drill about 1.5 inches to 2 inches deep. And as you can see in this photo, there's a blue bit on the drill bit, and that is a stop. That's basically to remind you to not drill any further, and I suggest doing that to your drill bit at home. You want to drill straight in and straight out, and if you can't drill straight in, drill at a slightly upwards angle, but right around 5 degrees, just barely, and you definitely don't want to be angled down. And the reason I say straight out as well is because pulling the drill out can be as important as putting your drill in. You want to make sure you're drilling nice and straight and you're not creating an oval tap hole. And the way a lot of people oval their tap holes is because they'll pull the drill out at a slightly different angle than when they put it into the tree. And another trick is to keep your drill running forward when you pull it out, because this will pull the sawdust with the drill. You want to make sure there's not too much sawdust in your tap hole because it will clog your taps and just cause problems later. And the last step is actually putting your tap in. What you want to do is tap your tap. And what I mean by that is you want to only hit it lightly. Just put your tap into the tree with a hammer far enough so it stops moving. That's not because it's hit the back of your tap hole, it's just because it's seated itself in the hole. You'll actually hear the pitch change, but your tap is only going to be about 1/2 inch into the tree, nowhere near the full depth of your hole. And I suggest if you're a first-time tapper and you're just doing this with a couple trees, tap less because it's always easier to go back and tighten your taps, but it is harder to pull your taps further out of the tree. Let's talk about boiling. The first question is, how often do you actually have to fire up your evaporator? And the answer is pretty frequently, because sap can spoil. It's kind of like milk. And the easiest way to avoid sap spoiling is to boil every day. If you're trying to hold your sap and not boil that often, you need to keep it cool. Keep it in a shaded location, or even better, refrigerate or freeze it if you can. Sap, when spoiled, turns kind of milky and will actually develop a sour smell to it. If you have sap that's spoiled, don't boil it because it will create sour syrup. Let's talk about evaporators. The example on the upper left corner is a readily available maple evaporator. It is meant for a smaller operation and it'll run you about $1,000. Or the other end of the spectrum is just use a soup pot or a pasta pot you already have and throw it on a burner, either on your stove or a propane burner outside, or you can design your own evaporator. When designing your own evaporator, you're trying to figure out a system that will make sap boil as fast as possible and water evaporate as fast as possible. And I highly suggest trying to find a flat pan. Stainless steel is what you're looking for. You want whatever you're using to be a food grade metal or stainless steel. The next part of your design is figuring out how you're going to heat it. The design on the left uses a cinder blocks to create a firebox under those pans, and there's a chimney in the back. This design is pretty easy to build. It does not take a lot of skill or tools to make. And the design on the right is a conversion of an old oil barrel. This was also made by somebody, but it took a little bit more skill and more tools and resources. So when thinking about how you want to evaporate, you can really take into account the resources you have. The next thing to think about is steam control. This also goes for smoke if you're thinking about using any kind of oil, wood, or gas in a confined space. The reason I talk about steam control is it's something a lot of people at home don't necessarily think about. If you're going to boil on your stove, it is going to get pretty steamy in your kitchen. Steamy enough that we've seen wallpaper peel off walls, so make sure you're in a well-ventilated space, or if you're doing it on your kitchen stove, make sure you have a pretty good hood on that stove. Now let's talk about some boiling pitfalls. The two major things to avoid are off flavors and burning. We've mentioned two of the off flavors, the first being buddy, signifying the end of the season, and the second being sour, coming from boiling spoiled sap. Other off flavors you can sometimes find are metabolism, which is actually a natural process of the tree and is pretty uncontrollable, but will sometimes happen. And then off flavors that you accidentally add. This could be off flavors from the containers you were keeping your sap in or boiling in. Another is off flavors that are introduced during the boiling process. Things like odorous chemicals if you're going to boil in your garage. The last pitfall is burning. And to talk about burning, I'm going to explain a little bit of the boiling process. When you're making small batch maple syrup, you often do what is called batch cooking. And that is where you just have 1 or 2 pans boiling at a time, and you're just constantly adding sap in on top of it as it boils down. This is a great way to make maple syrup, but as you get towards the end and you run out of extra sap to add, that's where people tend to get in trouble and end up boiling it too much and burning it to the bottom of your pan. So how do you avoid this? The answer is pull it off early. What I like to do is as I'm boiling down and getting near the end of my boil and running out of sap, I will actually stop stoking my fire if I'm using wood fire or get ready to turn it off and add the last little bit of sap and just let that dying fire bring it up to a boil and cook it down a little bit. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you're at syrup stage. So what I like to do is finish my syrup on a more controllable heat source, whether that's my kitchen stove or a propane burner outside. Now let's talk about bottling. What happens when you have a finished product? The first question is, when is it done? When is it considered maple syrup? And the first answer is sugar content. Maple syrup happens between 66 and 68% sugar. But if you're not trying to sell your maple syrup and you're just making it for yourself and your family, you don't necessarily have to abide by this. You can just boil it down until it tastes good to you. The issue is if you're not at 66%, it is not considered shelf stable. So if you're doing this at home and you don't want to abide by how much the regulations on sugar content, just make sure you're refrigerating your finished product. Now, how do you test for sugar content? One way is temperature, and this is what I suggest for people at home. Syrup boils at 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. Now, it's hard to put a specific temperature on that because the boiling point of water can change with altitude and also atmospheric pressure. So the way to figure out where your boiling point is just boil a pot of water, stick a thermometer in it, and see what temperature that water is. Now, once you find that temperature, just add 7 degrees, and that will be the temperature at which your syrup boils. So keep a thermometer ready as your syrup gets thicker, and once it hits that temperature in the pot, pull it off the heat, you have maple syrup. The way a lot of people do it for commercial operations is through density and with a tool called a hydrometer. And that's this glass tube on your right. And hydrometers are very accurate. And that's why people use them when they're trying to sell their maple syrup commercially. The next step is filtering. Before you bottle your maple syrup, you want to filter it. And this is because during the boiling process, maple syrup develops something called niter, or sugar sands. If you're at home and you're not trying to sell your syrup commercially, don't worry about filtering it. These sugar sands will just settle over time as it sits in your fridge or on your shelf. But if you want to filter it or you're trying to sell it, a good way to do it for a small scale operation is through a cloth cone filter, which is the picture on the lower right. What you do is you take your hot syrup and just pour it through this cone and let it drain off the bottom into another container. And as it pours out, all those sugar sands will get caught in that filter and you'll have nice crystal clear maple syrup. Now let's talk about bottling. Because maple syrup has so much sugar in it, it is shelf stable. But if there are contaminants in it, it will develop a little mold at the top. So what we do is we want to heat up that maple syrup to 182 degrees to kill anything in it that would cause it to mold and pour it into clean containers. Just make sure they are food grade and you just seal them. And what you want to make sure you do is flip them upside down because that hot syrup will sanitize the lid. Now let's talk about marketing. We've been talking about backyarding and I've been giving you some options if you're not going to sell it. Now, if you want to sell your maple syrup, the first thing to do is get on the WDA website and find the maple regulations. They've started regulating what your sugar shack has to look like and what your labels say. And these two things are good things to check out in terms of any kind of product you're trying to sell. And the next thing is to start understanding syrup grades and the difference between color and grade. Color does not necessarily mean quality in maple syrup. You can have quality syrup of any color, and color more has to do with how it was boiled, when it was boiled, where it was boiled, than anything else. So grade A means that there's no off flavors. You then look at color. You can have golden syrup, amber syrup, dark syrup, and very dark syrup. And there are color grading kits that you can get to understand what color your syrup falls in. For grade A syrup, let's talk price. Our bulk price for syrup right now is right around $22 a gallon. And bulk means you're selling in about 55-gallon drums. For a backyard operation, you're not really looking at bulk sales. You're looking more at retail. And at retail, you can get between $55 and $85 a gallon. And that depends on the size of your bottles, the shape of your bottles, and it also depends on where you're selling it. You'll get more money if you're willing to travel to more metropolitan areas or even out of state than you would necessarily selling at your local farmer's market. So your retail price is going to depend on how much effort you want to put into retailing it. Another way to add some money to the equation is with value added. Value added products are things like maple candy, maple cream, maple cotton candy, maple sugar, all these things that just take your maple syrup a step further and therefore add value. For an example, let's look at maple cotton candy. You can take a gallon of maple syrup and sell it for, let's say, $65. Or you can take that gallon of maple syrup, make it into maple sugar, and run it through your cotton candy machine at a fair. All of a sudden, that gallon of maple syrup went from $65 retail to, let's say, $600 for cotton candy if you're selling it at about $4 or $5 a bag. That's a big difference, and it's a way to extend your product and get more profit from what you've made. Some other value-added products people have started dabbling in is things that add other ingredients, like maple apple butter or maple mustard. All of these things will kind of help create a higher profit margin in your maple operation. Another new thing that's coming on the market that does not take a lot of effort are infusions. Bourbon barrel maple syrup, cinnamon maple syrup, coffee maple syrup, vanilla maple syrup. And the last value-added thing I want to touch on is something that's very new in the market, and it is other species. The most prominent one right now is black walnut syrup. People have started making black walnut syrup and are selling straight black walnut syrup, but also mixing it with some maple syrup. And all these things just help bump up your profit margin. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. As I said, my name is Kate Fotos. Here are my emails. Feel free to reach out with any maple-related questions I hope that all of you go out and tap a maple tree next maple season in your backyard and have some fun. Thanks for listening.